everyone. I think it's good afternoon for most of us, but also good evening or good night. So thank you for attending the session. As you've probably noticed in the program, I'm here to share with you some thoughts, some research about team adaptation in space analog context. Specifically, this will be about some data me and my collaborators have been collecting in Antarctica over the past couple of years, trying to figure out how exactly people change the way they behave in extreme environments to deal with the challenges that are specific of those environments and sustain performance. Okay, so for instance, imagine a snowstorm that prevents outside activities for a full week. And this doesn't sound that hard, but now think that you only have 2 weeks to complete your mission, right? So you just lose all of the time available to do your work. Now, sometimes it also happens that there's a psychotic break from a fellow team member that demands immediate attention, like locking that person down until someone can actually transport the person out of Antarctica. And for instance, sometimes it also happens that scuba divers in Antarctica are attacked by leopard seals and they somehow have to escape them. To give you an idea, a leopard seal in Antarctica, it's more or less the same as a white shark in not so cold waters. Now, all of these examples are real life illustrations of how important it is for teams in Antarctica to be able to make quick decisions, change the way they are working, and on one side evade or avoid the challenges, and on the other side be able to maintain their level of performance, because at the end of the mission or at the end of the campaign they have to stay healthy, they have to stay alive, and they have scientific goals they have to achieve. Now, surprisingly, the social sciences have neglected not only the nature of the events, although there's quite some research about the nature of these events, of course, but especially the behaviors in which crews or teams engage to deal with those problems and find a solution to them. So we know since a long time, for instance, that psychological factors such as stress, anxiety, depression, or hostility, they are well-known psychological consequences of living in isolated, confined, extreme environments, such as the case of Antarctica and of naturally space. We also know that, for instance, these psychological factors, they result from what we call environmental stressors, such as the abnormal sunlight cycles or the extreme weather conditions, but they also result from social stressors, such as the conflict or the cultural differences, or for instance, the language barriers that we also find in our day-to-day living. But because of the fact that people are isolated and confined, they become much more severe. It is as if their consequences are amplified by the isolation and confinement. This is more or less the same that most people experience during the lockdown because of COVID. So it's in some way, nowadays, everyone knows a little bit better how it feels like to be in an isolated, confined, and extreme environment, even though you might live in a big city. Now, to deal with these stressors, we also know that individuals and teams, they engage in what we call psychological adaptation processes, such as coping, okay, which are strategies that people use to somehow cope, emotionally cope or psychologically cope with stressful situations. Some examples are opening care packages, which is a common strategy during long duration missions to maintain morale or to somehow trigger positive emotions. And these include opening a letter from a loved one or receiving gifts during birthday that our partners or our friends kind of sneaked in the luggage, so that when during our birthday, for instance, we could open them in Antarctica. There are other strategies, let's say they are like less positive in the sense of how healthy they are, psychologically speaking. And these include avoiding social interactions, like avoiding interacting with those people with whom we are likely, we have more likelihood of experiencing some conflict or some friction. There's also some intentional minimization of the emotional experiences we have. So people try to avoid experiencing negative, especially negative emotions that have high intensity, or situation where that might happen, like rage, fury, or madness, angry at someone, and inevitably sometimes also addictive behaviors like smoking or drinking. Okay. Now, although we already the literature already contains quite an abundant number of studies about this specific topic, so psychological adaptation to the stressors of isolated, confined, and extreme environments. There's one particular piece of knowledge that remains unclear, or at least there's little empirical evidence on that, which is the way the people working in Antarctica or ice environments more broadly change the way they work in order to solve the problems that challenge their performance, challenge their well-being, or challenge their cohesion, for instance. And this research, this is what this research is about. Okay, so we know that from the team adaptation literature more broadly, so not only in ice environments, but like in offices or hospitals or in firefighters, we know that team adaptation can be generally described as a way of changing and adjusting relevant team processes, relevant team behaviors in response to disruptions or triggers that threaten performance. And these behaviors, we can kind of decompose them in three main behaviors, let's say. So some behaviors, they are meaningful, or they're about the mission planning or the organizing, which we call them transition processes, or about the way the mission is executed or implemented, and we call those action processes. And then finally, there are also behaviors relevant for adaptation, which include managing conflict or building motivation. And those are interpersonal processes. So as surprising as it might sound, there's not much empirical research actually addressing if these specific behaviors contribute to good performance in ice environments. Now, things get a little bit more interesting because besides the fact there's not so much research about the link between adaptation and performance, there's even less research looking at how contextual features of the environment, like the complexity of the challenges that teams face, or the origin of those challenges, or for instance, how long does a challenge or a problem stays active, which means it means that how long does it take to be solved? And these are all contextual features of the environment and contextual features of the problem that challenge the team's capacity to adapt. So in this specific study, we are trying to make a first effort towards answering this exact question. So how adaptation and performance relate, depending on, for instance, the kind of trigger or the complexity of the trigger or the challenge that teams are facing. So for this specific study, we collected field data at King George Island, Antarctica, between January, February 2020. We used a 15-minute self-report survey with psychological scales measuring teamwork processes, team outcomes, and some attributes of the challenges that teams at King George Island were facing. And these allow us to collect valid responses from 60 individuals. These 60 individuals, they belong to 21 teams. Okay, there's some high cultural diversity here. So you can see here that most of our participants, they were from Chile, Uruguay, Spain, and Portugal. Although we then also had participants from Bulgaria, Australia, Iran, etc. Most of our participants were male, and the mean age was 44 years old. So this is a small sample. Although kind of proportionalized, this sample represents at least the working population at King George Island. Also important to mention is the fact that in this sample in particular, most of our participants, they were living and working at research stations, although some of them were also at research vessels or ships, huts, and camps. Most of the management structure of the facilities here, they were managed by military and then civilian. So just an heads up, in Antarctica, the research stations, they're either managed by scientists or by military. And in terms of roles, most of the participants were scientists, and then a few were staff members and management. So before we actually engage in testing our hypotheses, we also wanted to know exactly what were the triggers or the adaptation challenges that the teams in our sample were facing. So we actually asked them to disclose which those events were, and then also measure their frequency in terms of how often were they mentioned. So, and we could find, for instance, that weather changes and technology failure were the most common or the most frequent kind of problems that these teams faced at King George Island. In total, we recorded over 87 adaptation events. Okay, so we asked our participants to disclose how many events requiring adaptation did they experience during the mission, and we use their responses then to categorize these adaptation triggers as internal triggers and external triggers. So one of the dimensions we studied regarding triggers was their origin. Okay, so we kind of grouped them in two groups. Okay, some triggers had to do with human-related challenges or activities, and other triggers had to do with the natural environment of Antarctica. Okay, so so we grouped them as either internal or external. And by using a multi-level modeling analysis, a statistical analysis, we found that, for instance, interpersonal processes and transition processes, they are the main predictors of team performance in Antarctica. So there's an interesting finding here, which is the fact that action processes, which for most of the team adaptation literature are the most important predictors of performance, in ice environments as Antarctica, they are also important, but they are not so important. Okay, so here the main message is that for good performance in ice environments as Antarctica, it's important that teams are able to display or change the way they behave regarding mission planning or organizing, which means that teams are able and willing to change the way they plan, or to change their plans actually, and also that they are capable of managing conflict and build motivation despite of the situation. Okay. Now, we also wanted to know if this relationship would change depending on the characteristics of the triggers, right? So we found out that the complexity of the trigger, so how difficult the trigger is not that important by itself. But if we combine the origin of the trigger with, the complexity of the trigger with its origin, it's like saying that an internal or external trigger can be very complex or not complex at all. So in this case, we did find some interesting results. We found that, for instance, the adaptation of team processes, especially interpersonal and transition processes, it's really important for team performance when teams face internal triggers, so team challenges that have a human cause, sort of saying, but that also have little complexity. So if teams adapt easily when they solve internal triggers that are easy to handle, but also, and most interestingly, when they have to solve external triggers like, let's say, a weather storm, if they are highly complex. Okay. Interestingly, if these external triggers, they have low complexity, adaptation won't enable or lead to performance. So it's like if teams needed to be challenged at under the most extreme conditions to actually engage in adaptation and ensure good performance. These findings, they kind of backed up by some previous data we collected, qualitative data, also on adaptation in Antarctica. And for instance, here you can see a quote about the way weather and the unpredictable weather changes happening at King George Island force teams to make decisions on the hour or by the hour. You have another example that is quite common actually, which is the fact that some researchers, they were waiting for their equipment, but the ship responsible for delivering the equipment delivered it in the wrong station. Okay, so they had to find a way to actually get the equipment back. Another example regards equipment that was broken, and the science teams had to collaborate and ask the support of the technicians at the station. And also another quote saying how important it is that you build a network, not only within your group, but also with other groups around you at the stations. So general conclusion, we can say that the adaptation of interpersonal processes and interpersonal processes is particularly important to ensure good performance in ice environments such as Antarctica and space. And the relationship between team adaptation and performance will be stronger under specific conditions of the triggers that teams face. Okay. Also, some takeaway messages with a more practical orientation. Teams in ice environments, and now I'm generalizing from Antarctica, they should plan as much as possible before and during the missions, as if there's some kind of constant adaptation of plans and strategy. Also fundamental, build strong and meaningful relationships with team members before the mission, during the mission, and with other people at the station or camp or vessel, because many times the only way to solve the challenges that teams will face is by collaborating with others. And finally, and most importantly, being open to change the way you work or how you work if that's not the best way to solve an unexpected challenge. Okay, so there's no gain or no benefit in trying to prove a point if you know or you see that your strategy is not the best one. Okay, thank you everyone for listening and for attending. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer your comments, your questions, if you have them.